This is a story about a little war. A war you never heard of. It wasn't fought with guns or bombs or drones. No blood was spilled. But make no mistake, this was an epic fight for freedom. Freedom of conscience for people of faith everywhere. On one side were powerful, single-minded visionaries intent on uniting the world under a plan they believed would benefit all mankind. Facing them, a handful of unsung heroes who stood their ground against the advancing tide of majority opinion. You're about to meet the major players on both sides of this conflict. They'll tell you the story in their own words, and you'll see how the outcome of their struggle could have affected the way people live and worship today. So let me set the stage. We start at the League of Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. The League was established after World War I to maintain peace and cooperation between member nations. After World War II, the United Nations took its place. In 1923, the League decided to study the great inconveniences caused in economic life by the use of the present calendar. They were hoping to introduce a more uniform, more rational measurement of time. You might ask why the revision of a perfectly good calendar should attract such high-level international interest. Well, truth be told, pressure for calendar reform had been building for decades. For many business leaders, the current calendar was an inconvenience. Or worse, the calendar was simply not business-friendly. So, the League of Nations invited the international community to submit proposals for improving the calendar. Ideas poured in, no less than 185 of them. But one idea that stood out was the brainchild of this gentleman, Moses Cotsworth. Mr. Moses B. Cotsworth, to be exact.
I suppose I'm still a railroad man at heart. Not a conductor, not an engineer. No, I found the system itself fascinating. The routes and rates and the timetables all organized and fitting together perfectly. It was a beautiful thing when it worked.
Cotsworth was a number cruncher for the railroad industry back in late 19th century England. Railroad bosses wanted standardized, systematic reports and projections. Cotsworth took up the challenge, but he was frustrated by the irregularities in the calendar.
My calculations were never perfect. True month-to-month comparisons were impossible, because the Gregorian calendar gives us months that vary in length from 28 to 31 days. Beside that, months and weeks and quarters don't sync with each other. So a month or a year can start right in the middle of the week. I worked long and hard trying to find practical answers. Could have solved it all by changing the orbits of the Earth and the Moon, but that was beyond my ability. So I found another solution: revise the calendar. Just a few simple changes.
A few simple changes, he says. I don't think so.
My idea was to start by dividing the year into 13 months instead of 12. Put the extra month right in the middle of the year. You give every month exactly 28 days, 4 weeks, and you have exactly 52 weeks per year. Every month begins on Sunday and ends on Saturday. Simple.
But ask any fifth grader how many days there are in a year with 13 months of 28 days each. Let's see, 28 times 13, that's 364. Now everyone knows that a normal year is 365 days long. And that was Cotsworth's fatal flaw. His calendar was a day short.
Not really. You see, I had that all worked out. I added that day to the end of the last week of the year. It would be a blank day, a day that had no name, no place in the week. Of course, there would be 2 blank days in leap years.
So let's take a look. In Cotsworth's calendar, the last weekday of every year would be a Saturday. But the next day would not be Sunday. It would be Cotsworth's blank day. After that, the new year would begin, with a Sunday, of course. Sound strange?
If my ideas were so strange, why do you think so many leaders in the business world approved? Consider this. With all months having the same number of days, billing cycles would match the months exactly. Year-to-year comparisons of income and expense would be precise. Planning and scheduling would be greatly simplified. It would be beautiful.
Cotsworth's plan might look good to a bean counter, but it may never have gained traction with big business without the support of one of America's most prominent businessmen, George Eastman. This is George Eastman of Eastman Kodak fame. Cotsworth calendar first came to his attention in 1924.
Moses Cotsworth had been carrying on his work single-handed for 25 years. I had our statistical department make a study of his plan, and I personally conducted an independent investigation of the whole calendar movement. The more I learned, the more I became convinced that this man was performing a great public service. I made up my mind to back him with financial support and whatever influence I had.
Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg urged George Eastman to chair a national committee on calendar simplification.
It wasn't an official government committee, but we had members from the Departments of Agriculture, Commerce, Interior, Labor, and Treasury. And we had the publisher of the New York Times, the presidents of General Electric, General Motors, Wells Fargo Bank, and even Henry Ford himself. It was a powerful group.
Miss Elizabeth Acalis came from an influential New York family. Unmarried and free of family responsibilities, she was motivated by a strong desire to make her life count.
The problem was that everyone had their own calendar. For instance, there were 5 conflicting calendars in the Balkan countries. There was calendar confusion in Turkey, Egypt, and other African states. And India alone had at least 16 different calendars.
Her mission? To promote global harmony, order, balance, and stability.
The world needs a calendar for the 20th century, not the world of 2,000 years ago. In my view, reform was absolutely necessary. I believed change was inevitable. I decided to use my inheritance to help make it happen.
Of course, like every story, this one has another side. You see, not everyone was on board with calendar reform. In fact, many were vehemently opposed. Jews and Seventh-day Adventists led the opposition. Why? Because a blank day would create a conflict for Sabbath keepers. It would interrupt the continuity of the weekly cycle, the rhythm of religious life marked by the seventh-day Sabbath. The effect would be the same for conscientious Sunday keepers. Here's what would happen. The last week of year 1 would end on a Saturday. The next day, which would normally be a Sunday, is now a blank day, pushing the first Sunday of year 2 ahead to what would have been Monday. Monday then falls on what should be Tuesday, and so on. So, for all of year 2, Saturday falls on what would have been Sunday. Rabbi Joseph Hertz, chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the British Empire, voiced the objections of Jews all over the world.
The proponents of calendar reform had studiously glossed over the fact that the blank day would alter the true days of the week. They failed to note the all-important circumstance that the immemorial sequence of 7-day weeks would be interrupted, that our whole system of time reckoning, with the sacred traditions and spiritual landmarks built upon it, would be upset, and that the Sabbath would move to a different weekday each year. Disastrous results would follow in our religious life in the wake of a wandering Sabbath. For loyal Jews, the economic difficulties involved in Sabbath observance would become overwhelming.
But for calendar reformers, business trumped religion. They were unsympathetic to objections from any religious group.
In my opinion, if anyone suffered hardship because of the new calendar, it would be due to a continual refusal to conform to the preference of the majority. The difficulty resides in the religious convictions of the people in question. Any problem would be entirely of their own making.
On that point, I agreed with Mr. Eastman. Personal conscience does not override the interest of the larger world. People must disregard any unnecessary religious scruples. God does not require such precision and rigidness as they think.
It's quite a statement. So, that's where things stood by the middle of 1931. Calendar reform zealots, in league with big business, prepared to sweep away their opposition. In their opinion, religious objections were irrelevant. They were primed for victory. On August 5, 1931, Charles H. Watson, president of the worldwide Seventh-day Adventist Church, received a letter that came from Albert de Forence, the acting Secretary General of the League of Nations. The letter was a formal invitation for the Adventist Church to send an observer to Geneva to attend the League's Fourth General Conference on Communication and Transit. Calendar reform was on the agenda. Watson referred the matter to his executive committee. C.S. Longacre, head of the Religious Liberty Department, was a member.
We had to decide who to send to Geneva. We needed someone competent to represent our church at the highest levels of international politics, someone bold and sophisticated, with good contacts amongst our Jewish allies. Who better than Arthur Maxwell, a young Adventist administrator with wisdom and experience far beyond his years, yes. Arthur Maxwell was our man.
Maxwell was the editor at Stanborough Press, the Adventist publishing house just outside London. He accepted the challenge of going to Geneva, but not without reservation.
I felt a bit like little David going up against Goliath. Geneva had become the political capital of the world, and the League of Nations was the world's biggest stage. I was happy to hear that the leadership in Washington had voted to send several others with me.
The League of Nations' Fourth General Conference on Communication and Transit convened, as scheduled, on October 12, 1931. There were delegations representing 42 different countries. Presiding over the affair was Augusto de Vasconcelos.
Gentlemen, please come to order. We have a number of invited guests who are here to observe our deliberations. They will contribute in a limited way to our consideration of calendar revisions. They represent social organizations and religious groups that share our interest in the matter at hand. I beg your indulgence as we delay the start of our session in order to give these guests an opportunity to present their views. Each speaker will have 15 minutes, after which they will not engage in further discussion. When each one has had the opportunity to enlighten us, we will commence our official session.
I suppose we should have been grateful that we were given the privilege to speak at all, but with such limited time to speak, I was afraid that we would not have time for a convincing argument. One of my colleagues was particularly unhappy with the arrangement.
He's talking about Dr. John Nussbaum, one of the Adventist observers who joined him in Geneva. Nussbaum was an evangelist and a medical doctor with an active practice in Paris. But that's not why the church leaders wanted him in Geneva. Born and raised in Switzerland and educated in France, Nussbaum had friends in high places. The future president of Yugoslavia was his wife's godfather.
I went to Geneva, fully expecting a fair debate over the issues, but I could see this was not going to happen. It became more obvious when the first speaker took the floor. He was a private individual from Germany with his own calendar ideas, but the unfortunate man's words fell on deaf ears. The delegates simply ignored him. They showed him no respect at all. I resolved that under the circumstances, I would not take my place among the speakers. I expressed my disappointment to Mr. Djoricic, the Yugoslavian vice-chairman of the conference. He urged me to put aside my personal feelings, put my name on the speakers list, but this I could not do. My own brethren pressed me, but to no avail. I regretted having agreed to attend in the first place.
I was sympathetic with the good doctor, but I had come across the Atlantic to help stem the rising tide of calendar reform excitement, and now it seemed we were witnessing a travesty. I did my best to convince John to take the stand, but he was adamant.
Longacre and the others sensed the anti-Jewish tension in the room when Rabbi Joseph Hertz rose to speak.
The members of this conference may be puzzled at the strenuous and unalterable opposition of Jewish and other bodies to the schemes of calendar change now under consideration. But you will no longer be puzzled if you learn the implications of the crucial feature of these schemes, the blank day. This necessary feature of the calendar schemes under consideration would cause the true Sabbath to wander through the civil calendar from year to year. The Sabbath is, in every sense of the term, a fundamental institution of Jewish life. The blank day scheme, if adopted, would inevitably spell material ruin to millions of conscientious Jews throughout the world. The Jewish people look to the League of Nations to protect their rights in the face of what would be a crushing disaster.
I remember there was quite a commotion in the room when the rabbi finished his address. From where I sat, I couldn't tell whether there was sympathy or hostility. Probably was some of each. When the delegates finally settled down, I introduced Mr. Maxwell.
Weekly days of worship and prayer are the essential foundations of religious practice. Consider the difficulties that would confront the religious minority who decided to adhere to the 7-day cycle. Where would they find employment? What business would hire a man with a wandering Sabbath? Imagine the educational embarrassments they would suffer, and fines, possible imprisonment they would incur for keeping their children from school on their holy day. It surely could not be right that such people, by the tens of thousands, of the best type of citizen, normally law-abiding, honest, good living, the very salt of the earth, should be discriminated against in this way. Our world needs such people as these to anchor our society to the common principles of morality, to model the ideals that define a peaceful and enlightened civilization. Shall it be said that the League of Nations was party to an attack upon the rights of this conscientious minority? God forbid.
He was so articulate in his defense of personal conscience. The delegates simply could not ignore his argument. I was delighted.
For those opposed to reform proposals, Maxwell's statement was the high point of the day. Then C.S. Longacre took his turn to speak, representing the International Religious Liberty Association.
Gentlemen, I hold in my hand petitions of protest against any calendar proposal that includes the blank day scheme. 220,000 from America, 144,000 from Germany and Central Europe, plus scores of thousands from England, the Baltic states, the Philippine Islands, and many more. Now, you may have heard a rumor about the churches in America, that most of them are in full agreement with the blank day proposal. Well, I have brought a letter of protest from the Disciples of Christ denomination, 3.5 million members, and from the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, D.C., 8 bishops of the Methodist Episcopal Church in the USA, and from several leading Baptist officials. I can assure you, gentlemen, the rumor about churches in America is quite simply false. What you have heard about the worldwide support for calendar change is merely propaganda. The fact of the matter is there is no groundswell of public support. People are not beating down the doors of their legislatures demanding calendar reform. Now, there is a big business machine pushing this so-called calendar reform movement. There is big money behind it. But the public in general is not interested.
Longacre hoped that his petitions and resolutions of protest would sway the delegates. He did his best to counter the misinformation that had been spread by the pro-reform parties. The question was, would it be enough?
Mr. Chairman, gentlemen, thank you for your kind attention. It has been said here that big business interests are pushing my proposal. Let me assure you, I am not a businessman by any definition of the term, nor am I part of some big business machine. As to my motives, I have nothing to gain. No wealth would accrue to me were my proposal adopted. Gentlemen, I do this for sheer love of mankind, for the betterment of men everywhere. So I pay little heed to the opposition from the rabbis and their allies. They're desperately trying to maintain useless traditions and customs. But I assure you, their efforts against calendar reform are bound to fail. My calendar is not a novelty. It has been around for many years. Both the governments of Great Britain and Canada have published and circulated my proposal. I've personally found support for it.
Mr. Cotsworth went on to highlight the key features of his plan. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. The delegates applauded loudly. He clearly had them in the palm of his hand. This is what we'd been afraid of, the sheer power of this man's influence. Oh, we knew we'd win some points with our petitions and appeals, but we also knew that we were the lightweights in this match. Moses Cotsworth was the undisputed king of calendar reform.
Then another vigorous proponent of reform took the floor. Elizabeth Achelis had already established herself as a force to be reckoned with. She stood before the delegates with obvious confidence in her ability to win them over.
It is a great honor to be included in this conference with Mr. Cotsworth. He is without a doubt the most experienced and respected advocate of calendar reform in the world today. Gentlemen, our current calendar, the Gregorian calendar, was merely a small step of improvement over the Julian calendar, which dates back to before the time of Christ. Now is the time for a worldwide reform, one that benefits all nations, all mankind. We must agree together to break with the past. There are, however, a few people who stand in the way. Fortunately, only a small minority. By insisting on their own rights, they fail to show love for their fellow man. Their interpretation of the Sabbath is far too literal. Surely God will be happy with 1 day in 7. So let them remain bound to their meaningless traditions. They'll only bring hardship upon themselves. Calendar reform will come. The world will simply pass them by.
Moses Cotsworth and Elizabeth Achelis set the tone for other pro-reform speakers. One by one they took the stand, declaring that change was essential. It is only a matter of time, they said, and the sooner the better.
No question, we were worried. We were getting buried by all this pro-reform propaganda. We had no chance for rebuttal. We had literally run out of time.
At midday, Mr. Vasconcelos announced a recess. The Adventist observers huddled, speaking in worried tones. Notably absent from the group was Dr. John Nussbaum.
Frankly, I was so irritated by the whole affair, I just wanted to get away. A friend took me in his car to a small cafe in the country outside Geneva. It was good to get away from the city, away from this disaster that was shaping up back at the League of Nations.
It did look grim indeed. But the rest of us were still hoping that God would somehow intervene. We could only sit and watch as the conference resumed.
The strongest push for calendar reform came from the United States. Though George Eastman was unable to travel for health reasons, his committee spearheaded the effort. The vice chairman, Dr. Charles Marvin, took the lead. Marvin was the chief of the U.S. Weather Bureau. His fellow delegates assumed that he spoke as the official voice of the U.S. government.
As soon as I stood up to speak, this man, Mr. Longacre, interrupted.
I'd been waiting for this moment. Mr. Chairman, I said, I challenge the right of Dr. Marvin to speak on behalf of the government of the United States of America.
It's true. I was not representing the government. I attended the conference as an expert on calendar reform. So I apologize to the committee for any misunderstanding of my position. I only wish that the gentleman had approached me in private rather than embarrass me before the entire committee.
Marvin launched into a forceful argument for calendar reform. He was articulate, rational, and persuasive. Then he turned his attention to the Seventh-day Adventists.
Gentlemen, Mr. Longacre and his so-called Sabbath keepers are creating problems where there are none. Their opposition to the blank day plan defies logic. The blank day simply extends the last week of the year by 1 day. That's 1 8-day week at the end of each year. It's like having an extra Sabbath. And what could possibly be wrong with that? Now, I can understand the Jewish argument. They are defending a custom that goes back to Moses and beyond. But the Seventh-day Adventists, they claim to be Christians. Are they ignorant of the fact that the early day Christians themselves had an 8-day week? That's what happened when they started observing Sundays instead of the Jewish Sabbath. And here's another example. After the United States purchased Alaska from the Russians, they replaced the old Julian calendar with the Gregorian calendar, the calendar most of us use today. When that change occurred, the people of Alaska had an 8-day week. Now, where were the protests from the Seventh-day Adventists then? Gentlemen, these people need to wake up to the fact that their Sabbath is simply out of place in today's world. Their opposition to the new calendar makes no sense whatsoever.
At that point, our group, including the rabbi, was feeling a sense of desperation. Mr. Marvin was clouding things with irrelevant, nonsensical arguments, diverting attention from the real issues, and the other delegates seemed to be buying it.
But the worst was still to come. Émile Marchand, the Swiss delegate, spoke up, striking directly at the principle of religious liberty.
I must take issue with the Seventh-day Adventists and their allies who oppose the blank day calendar. They are brewing a tempest in a teacup. The fears they express are groundless, mere exaggerations created by their own paranoid imaginations. I offer my own country as an example. Here in Switzerland, the Adventists claim that they have suffered hardship because they refuse to send their children to Saturday classes. This is a complete fabrication. Nothing more than propaganda. I've never heard of even a single such case. Gentlemen, we must not allow the progress of peace and unity to be hampered by those who insist on too broad an interpretation of religious liberty. Yes, we are all free to choose our own religion. We may believe our own doctrines and creeds. we may live out our convictions in the privacy of our homes and within the walls of our churches. But our individual rights end where the needs of society begin. The principle, quite simply, is this: individual conscience must always yield to the greater good. The actions of a minority must be subject to the will of the majority.
Minority subject to the majority. Welcome to the Dark Ages.
As the committee went into break, noisy debates about the meaning of religious liberty filled the air. Jewish and Adventist observers knew that crucial issues hung in the balance.
I remember something that Rabbi Hertz said to me at another critical moment, a dire warning. Do you remember?
I recall saying that if this thing comes, it will smash your church in 10 years.
Of course, I think you grossly underestimated the strength of our people and the commitment to their Bible Sabbath, but still, it sent chills up my spine.
Both Maxwell and I had already addressed the committee. Dr. Nussbaum had obstinately refused to speak. Now we saw him as our last, best hope. We implored him almost to the point of embarrassment. Finally, he agreed.
I went to Mr. Joricic once again. I asked him if he thought it was fair that our rights were being threatened, our positions misrepresented, and yet we had no chance to defend ourselves. He was sympathetic, but he had no authority to do anything about it. He did, however, offer some hope. He would speak with other delegates on our behalf. If enough of them agreed, the chairman might be persuaded to let me address the assembly.
Juricic was as good as his word. During the recess, he spoke with a number of the delegates about Dr. Nussbaum's appeal and secured their support.
Just before the committee went back into session, Juricic introduced me to Chairman Vasconcelos. He presented my request, along with a list of delegates who approved it. And the chairman's face, it turned red. He pounded his fist on the desk, shouting, "No, no, no!"
It had already been a long day, and I wanted to get on with things. I saw no reason to go over the same ground again.
Then Mr. Juricic walked away. He left me standing there in front of the angry chairman. I just stood there, without saying a word, until he asked, "Doctor, have you known Mr. Juricic for a long time?" I said, "I've known him about 48 hours. He asked, "Then why is it that he has taken up your case? What does it matter to him?" So I said, "Probably because Vojislav Marinkovic, his boss, is godfather to my wife." "Oh, Marinkovic," he said. "I know him well. He's my good friend." And then he smiled at me. He asked, "Could you tell me a little more about your problem?"
When Chairman Vasconcelos called the committee back to order, he made an unexpected announcement.
Dr. Nussbaum believes that certain delegates, in their enthusiasm for calendar reform, have misinterpreted the basic principles of liberty and have also misrepresented his church. I believe it is only fair to give him an opportunity to address these concerns.
We were all surprised. We had no idea what had gone on between Dr. Nussbaum, Mr. Juricic, and the chairman.
I remember the moment he took the podium. The room was electric. He had an air of authority about him as though he was clothed with power from heaven. He was accustomed to being listened to, and he just stood there until he knew he had everyone's attention.
Mr. Chairman, gentlemen, I thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of truth. Truth that has been trampled underfoot during this conference. This morning, Dr. Marvin, the esteemed delegate from the United States, declared that Christians had an 8-day week when they began observing Sunday in place of the Sabbath. While Dr. Marvin is a world-class expert in his field of specialty, he is clearly no historian. Any authoritative history of Christianity tells us that believers did not act in unison when they began rejecting the Sabbath in favor of Sunday. This happened over the course of many centuries. Each man made this choice according to his own free will. What Dr. Marvin and others would do is something completely different. They would bring the weight of international law to bear against those who would be faithful to the teachings of Jesus and the practices of the early church. Dr. Marvin said that an 8-day week occurred when the United States government brought Alaska under the Gregorian calendar. Well, but surely he is in a position to know that the 8-day week in question had nothing to do with the calendar itself. It resulted from a repositioning of the international dateline, a single event, not at all like the Reformed calendar's perpetual systematic addition of an extra day to the last week of every year. Miss Achilles would have you believe that the Holy Scriptures do not specify which day is to be observed as the Sabbath, but merely that we are to rest one day in the 7th. If this were so, we would, of course, not object to the observance of one day over another. But Miss Achilles is in error. The Scriptures plainly declare that the 7th day of the week is to be kept holy. It is God's day, not ours. We have no right to interfere with it. My countryman, Mr. Emile Marchand, has dismissed as mere paranoia the testimony of people who have suffered persecution right here in Switzerland. Sadly, he has misread the situation in his own country. Here there are laws that compel children to attend school on Saturdays. I myself was a victim of these laws. My Seventh-day Adventist parents did not send me to school on Saturdays. Again and again, my mother was brought before the judge. Again and again, fines were imposed. My parents did not waver. I am brought nearly to tears as I remember my dear mother's hands, red and raw from working to earn money to pay these fines. In addition to her duties at home, she was obliged to wash the clothes of other families, just to appease the demands of a heartless tyranny. And now Mr. Marchand has offered us an astounding definition of religious liberty. It is a definition that will reverse centuries of progress toward the very freedoms that mark a truly civilized society. He speaks to a liberty that is restricted to church buildings and private homes. Thus, he would deny men the right to live out their religion in public life. Mr. Marchand would deny to society itself the benefits of morality and grace that find their source in the hearts and lives of those who are guided by divinely enlightened conscience. His liberty is far too narrow. Gentlemen, there is a great deception being propagated by those who are pushing for the blank day calendar. It is this, that if some minorities suffer hardship because of the new calendar, they only have themselves to blame. They say the problem lies in the religious convictions of the minorities themselves. This is the argument used by tyrants of the past to justify their infamous persecutions. It is a grim doctrine indeed that those who suffer from bigotry do not do so because of injustice, but because of their own stubborn refusal to yield their consciences to the demands of the majority. If you adopt the proposed calendar, there will be victims. Perhaps millions of them. I cannot believe, gentlemen, that you will do such a thing. I cannot believe that the League of Nations would approve such an iniquity.
I'll never forget that moment. The room was quiet, and one by one the delegates started clapping. Some stood as the doctor left the podium and returned to his seat. Several reached out and shook his hand as he passed.
Without shame, I admit that there were tears in my eyes. I had just seen a hero of truth prevail in his stand against a flood of error. It was the defining moment in our struggle.
To be sure, Dr. Nussbaum's appeal reached the hearts of the delegates. I had pure logic and reason on my side, undeniably so. But who could argue with the doctor's own testimony?
I think Nussbaum was a master manipulator. His personal story, true or not, I don't know. Whatever the case, it aroused great sympathy for his position. It turned the tide against progress. As for me, I take the longer, broader view. I will continue the fight for reform.
Nussbaum and his Adventists and their peculiar doctrines. What will we do with them? A persecuted minority? They are a favored minority, holding the rest of us back from progress.
It was clear that there was nothing more to be said. The doctor had effectively disposed of his opponent's arguments, and there was no one to refute his account. He had won the day.
There would be several more days of wrangling over the details of the committee's report. But the best the pro-reform people could hope for was that the League of Nations would reconsider their proposal at some future time.
I never saw such a dejected lot of fellows after the conference was adjourned. Marvin, Cotsworth, and the other American delegates who worked for Mr. Eastman. I told Dr. Marvin that he would have another opportunity to bring the matter up in the future.
I admit it. I felt sick and discouraged, and I wished I had never gotten involved in the first place. There may be future opportunities for calendar reform. I hope so. But it'll take years to undo the damage, to counteract the influence of the strong Seventh-day Adventists' opposition. I will never live to see my plans consummated in my lifetime. Longacre and the others blasted all my hopes and plans.
It was hard to believe that a handful of religious zealots could derail our plans. There have always been people who are stuck in old ways, who oppose progressive ideas, but, well, they can't hold us back forever.
There were no big celebrations among either Jews or Seventh-day Adventists. Both groups had seen the possibility of defeat, and neither wanted to gloat. Longacre was right. The proponents of calendar reform repeated their efforts, but to no avail. The world was simply not ready for change. There were bigger issues to confront. The League of Nations itself died an ignoble death in the ashes of World War II. And since that time, the United Nations, the World Council of Churches, and the U.S. Congress have all considered the question of calendar reform, as did the Roman Catholic Ecumenical Council, known as Vatican II. The result has been the same. No agreement on a move away from the old Gregorian calendar. So, is calendar reform a dead issue? Well, yes and no. The International Standards Organization, better known as ISO, has gotten into the act. There's no blank day involved, no adjustment to the Gregorian year. Instead, there's a direct challenge to the week itself. The ISO has redefined the week as a sequence of days beginning with Monday and ending with Sunday. In many parts of the world, printed calendars reflect this new standard. Monday appears as the first day of the week, Sunday as the seventh. So, what are the implications for people of faith? Will a specific day of worship become irrelevant? Will Sabbath observers become increasingly marginalized? Only time will tell.